I built a company from scratch, turned down millions, and walked away from the one thing my family said I could never live without, all in a single day. And no, it wasn't a dramatic TV show. It was my brother's wedding. What happened there changed everything for me. My business, my family, and how I saw myself. You won't believe where they tried to seat me. But before I tell you what I did next, ask yourself this. What would you do if the people closest to you treated you like you didn't matter? You ever walked into a room thinking it would be a celebration, only to feel like the air changed the second you stepped in? Like you were the outsider in a story you helped write? That's what happened to me. On a night that was supposed to honor everything I had built, but instead of applause, I got silence. And not the respectful kind, the kind that hums with judgment. It wasn't just any night. It was the retirement gala of my mentor, the woman who opened doors for me when no one else would. A night where I was supposed to speak, where I was told I'd be front and center. But when I saw the table they'd put me at, near the service entrance, behind a floral arch no one even walked past, I knew exactly what they thought of me. It wasn't about forgetting. It was intentional. A message hidden under soft lighting and polite smiles. You don't belong here. Not with them. Not after what I'd achieved. It was subtle. But after a lifetime of reading between the lines, I didn't miss it. In that moment, I had a choice. Swallow the disrespect and smile through it, or remind them who I was and what I had built. I chose the second, not out of pride, but because sometimes silence isn't classy. It's complicity. And I wasn't going to be complicit in my own erasure. So let me take you back, not just to that night, but to the long road that led there. A road paved with rejection, resilience, and one big moment when I finally stopped asking for a seat and started building my own table. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 41, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I'm the founder and CEO of Linksware Systems, a cybersecurity firm I started in my apartment with nothing but an overclocked laptop and a coffee habit that scared my cardiologist. These days, my name shows up in Forbes, and my clients include Fortune 500 companies. But for most of my life, I was just Claire. You know the type. Quiet, observant, never the loudest voice in the room, but always the one with a plan. I didn't come from legacy. No golden last name, no built-in network. Just a single mom, 2 jobs, and an old desktop she bought secondhand to keep me curious. That clunky machine became my sanctuary, and eventually my gateway. I wasn't the prodigy people love to write about. I wasn't winning hackathons at 10 or coding banking systems by 12. I was just relentless. Every line of code was one step closer to proving I belonged. I didn't need to be a child genius. I just needed to refuse to quit. And while I was building my empire in silence, my family, well, they were busy pretending not to notice. My younger cousin Derek, he got more attention for making junior varsity than I did for landing a Department of Defense contract. Every Christmas felt like a networking event I hadn't been invited to, even though I shared the same bloodline. But I kept showing up. I kept building. Because deep down, I believed that eventually, success would earn me respect. That someday, they'd have no choice but to see me. What I didn't know was, some people will never see you unless you force them to open their eyes. It was my Aunt Linda's idea to throw the gala. A celebration of legacy, she said, as if my mentor's accomplishments somehow flowed through family trees like heirlooms. I was invited, of course, but not consulted, not asked to speak, not asked to contribute, just expected to show up, smile, and clap. That would have been fine if they hadn't turned it into something more, because buried in the invitation was a passive-aggressive twist. Derek would be giving the keynote. Derek, who worked 6 months in tech before pivoting to fitness coaching. Derek, who once told me, cybersecurity's just fear marketing. It hit me harder than I expected. Not because I needed the spotlight, but because the pattern was so familiar. Reward the charming, dismiss the consistent, celebrate the showy, ignore the steady. And every time I let it go, it felt like I was agreeing with them. I remember staring at the seating chart that night, realizing I was placed at the overflow table. No nameplate, no intro, just Claire, again. It's not a big deal, I told myself. You're not here for them. But those thoughts rang hollow when my achievements had literally built part of the software running that evening's security. So I got up. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a speech. I just stood, walked to the bar, and texted my assistant to pull the press release for a new product drop for that same night. If they wouldn't make space for me, I'd take up space in a way no one could ignore. If this story moved something in you, if you felt seen, even just for a moment, consider tapping the super thanks button just below the video. It's that little heart icon with the $sign. Every contribution, no matter the size, helps keep this channel alive so we can keep sharing stories that actually matter. Your support doesn't just help me. It tells the algorithm, this kind of story deserves to be heard. So thank you, truly. You know, moments like that, they stay with you. If you've ever been in a room full of people and still felt invisible, you're not alone. And hey, if this story is already resonating with you even a little bit, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I share stories just like this. Real, raw, and powerful. Because sometimes, hearing that someone else stood up for themselves reminds you that you can too. I don't know if you've ever been in that space, where you've worked so hard for something, poured your soul into every detail, and then watched it get shrugged off like it meant nothing. That kind of pain isn't loud, it's subtle, like a small crack in glass you keep ignoring, until the whole thing finally shatters. That's what it felt like. Not rage, not even sadness, just tired. It's the exhaustion of having to prove yourself over and over, to people who already made up their minds about you before you ever had a chance. You keep thinking, if I just work a little harder, if I make one more achievement, then they'll see me. But deep down, you already know they won't. Because seeing you would mean rewriting the version of the story they like best. It's not about you being invisible. It's about you being inconvenient to the narrative. And if you're anything like me, you've probably been carrying that weight for years. Maybe your story didn't happen at a fancy gala. Maybe it was at a family dinner where your promotion barely earned a nod, while someone else's new car got a toast. But here's the truth. That pain, it's valid. You're not being dramatic. You're not overreacting. You're just waking up to the fact that your worth isn't something anyone else is allowed to rank. That realization, it hurts like hell, but it's also the first step toward freedom. And maybe, just maybe, you're hearing this at the exact moment you needed to, because we all reach a point when enough is enough, when being polite starts to feel like self-betrayal, and when the quiet ones finally stand up. People notice. Deep down, I used to think that if I just became undeniably great, then everything would fall into place. That success would be a kind of armor, that it would protect me from being overlooked or underestimated. I thought my resume would speak for me. But I learned the hard way. It doesn't matter how loud your success is if people have already decided not to listen. There was this constant ache, a question that lived in my chest. What else do I have to do? I wasn't chasing validation from strangers. I just wanted the people closest to me to look me in the eye and say, I see you, I'm proud of you. But instead, all I got was silence dressed up as civility. I began shrinking without even realizing it, saying, it's fine, when it wasn't, letting things slide because calling them out felt too much, playing small because every time I showed up fully, someone made sure I felt like I was taking up too much space, and I bought into it, for years. But something changed that night. It wasn't the insult. It was the clarity that followed, the realization that I was still waiting for permission to matter to people who had no intention of ever giving it. And suddenly, I didn't want their permission anymore. That shift, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it was final. I decided then and there that I was done negotiating my value. Not at the table, not at family gatherings, not even in my own mind. And honestly, that choice felt more powerful than any contract I'd ever signed. Walking out of that room, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't unsee what had just happened. You can't return to playing your role once you realize the script was never written with you in mind. And I wasn't about to stay quiet and pretend I hadn't noticed. Not anymore. That night didn't just show me how they saw me. It reminded me of how they'd always seen me. And I couldn't help but trace it all the way back to the beginning, before Linksware, before the funding rounds, before the interviews and awards. Back to when all I wanted was to be taken seriously for the things I loved. It started in childhood, as it usually does. And when I look back now, I see all the little cracks forming, one after another. The missed school plays, the "not now, Claire" comments, the way my ideas were always cute, but never considered. It was never a scream. It was always a whisper that said, you're not the one we're rooting for. And still, I kept hoping. Maybe that's the hardest part to admit, that even after all the times I felt small, I still believed they'd come around, that someday, the people who barely clapped would finally stand. But hope, when it goes unfulfilled too long, starts to sour, and mine had turned bitter. So if we're going to talk about that night, we have to talk about what came before it, because no one snaps in a single moment. It builds, layer by layer, until one day, you finally say, enough. And for me, that day started years ago, on a quiet street, in a small house, where I first learned that being unseen could still hurt like a bruise. Back then, things felt simpler, before ambition, before comparison, before I knew what it meant to feel like the extra piece in my own family. Growing up in a modest 2-story house in Spokane, Washington, I remember Saturday mornings that smelled like pancakes and floor cleaner. My mom played Motown on the old stereo, and I'd sit by the window, sketching ideas in notebooks no one ever read. My dad worked long shifts at the freight yard, but when he was home, he'd throw a football around with Derek in the backyard. I'd watch from the porch, sometimes trying to join, sometimes not. I didn't feel left out yet, just different. I didn't love sports. I loved patterns, logic puzzles, lines of code I copied from borrowed library books. Every summer, we'd spend a week at Lake Pandorel. I'd collect rocks and name them. Derek would jump off the dock like he was invincible. We were just kids then. No labels, no favorites, just cousins chasing dragonflies and inventing secret codes we'd forget by fall. At school, I was always the quiet one, the girl who finished the group project while others joked around. Teachers loved me, but classmates didn't quite get me. I didn't mind. Home was where I felt safe. My mom always said I was an old soul. I wore that like a badge. But the older we got, the more that peaceful rhythm started to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in, like shadows at dusk, slowly enough that you don't notice it until the light's gone. That was the beginning of something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Middle school was when the dividing lines got clearer. Derek became the golden boy, athletic, outgoing, the kid who could charm a room without trying. Family dinners slowly shifted. Conversations revolved around his soccer tournaments, his weekend trips, his potential. And I became the smart one, but not in a way that invited curiosity. More like a label slapped on a box no one intended to open. At first, I didn't mind. I was proud of being smart. I liked being the one people asked for help with science homework. But it soon became obvious that no one was really interested in what I loved. They'd smile politely, then change the subject. The second Derek walked into a room, everyone lit up like Christmas lights. One Thanksgiving, I excitedly shared that I'd been selected for a regional coding competition. My uncle nodded vaguely, then turned to ask Derek how tryouts had gone. No one asked what kind of competition it was. No one even noticed when I stopped talking. I remember picking at my mashed potatoes, wondering if I was invisible or just inconvenient. The message wasn't loud, but it was clear. Derek's accomplishments were family events. Mine were just mine. Private victories, muted celebrations. And slowly, I started keeping them to myself. What's the point of sharing when no one's really listening? That's the thing about being overlooked. It doesn't hurt because people don't love you. It hurts because they do, and still don't see you. That's a different kind of loneliness, one that wraps around you quietly. So even when you're surrounded, you feel completely alone. By high school, it wasn't just silence. It was narrative. Derek was destined for greatness. Natural leadership, they'd say. A people person. He was voted class president junior year, and they framed the newspaper clipping in our living room. I got accepted into a pre-college STEM program at Caltech that same year. No one printed that. They weren't cruel about it. That's what made it harder to name. It wasn't bullying. It wasn't mean. It was just consistent omission, constant redirection. Like my wins didn't fit their vision of what success looked like. They didn't say I wasn't enough. They just never acted like I was. When Derek crashed his car junior year, the whole family rallied. Fundraisers, visits, support. When I got my first paid freelance coding job at 16, they asked me, "But is it even legal for you to do that?" I smiled, laughed it off, shrugged, even though something inside me cracked a little. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval, that one day I'd make it so big they couldn't ignore me, that my success would be undeniable, like sunlight through a window you have to look at. I clung to that idea like a lifeline, but what I didn't know yet, what would take years to realize, is that sometimes, even when the sun shines directly on people, they still close the blinds. Not because they can't see it, but because they don't want to. Back then, I still believed things would change, that if I just kept my head down, worked hard, and stayed humble, they'd see it one day. I imagined big moments, graduations, awards, first press mentions, where everything would click and someone would finally say, "Claire, we're proud of you." It sounds simple, but it was the dream I clung to. I used to rehearse how it would feel. My dad clapping me on the back with real pride. My mom introducing me at parties as the brilliant one. I didn't need a parade, just eye contact, just acknowledgement, just someone looking at me like I mattered. That's the dangerous thing about hope. It doesn't always warn you when it's turning into fantasy. And mine had been rotting slowly in the dark. I was building success on the outside and still quietly waiting for validation on the inside. Like some part of me couldn't let go of their approval. Even when I knew better. I kept thinking if I changed how I showed up, maybe they'd change how they responded. If I acted more confident, more outgoing, more like Derek, then maybe I'd fit their mold. I spent years trying to be palatable to people who never asked for more of me. They just asked for less. And yet, the longing remained. Not every day, but in those quiet, tired moments when the emails were done and the city lights were humming outside my window. I'd feel that ache in my chest, the one that whispered, "You've done everything right, so why do you still feel unseen?" By college, the pattern had hardened into something almost ritualistic. I graduated early with dual degrees. No one from my family came to the ceremony. Derek failed out of his business program twice, and still got a welcome back barbecue when he transferred schools. My accomplishments became background noise. His missteps became community efforts. They'd send me messages like, "Hope you're doing great, kiddo," but never ask about my work. When I launched Linksware, not a single one of them asked what it did, not even out of curiosity. Meanwhile, when Derek opened his gym, they shared the post like it was a Fortune 100 IPO, and I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need it, but something in me wanted it, and I hated that. I hated that after all my independence, all my grit, I still felt like a teenager waiting to be noticed. Like maybe I hadn't outgrown their silence, I'd just gotten used to it. Then came the photos, family events I wasn't invited to, holiday dinners I found out about through Instagram, birthday parties with captions like, "So proud of our future CEO," under pictures of Derek, who'd just gotten a brand partnership for protein powder. That was the moment it shifted from silence to erasure. And that kind of erasure isn't loud. It's slow, strategic, dressed up as forgetfulness. But you feel it, deep in your bones. You feel it when you show up with receipts and no one wants to look. You feel it when people smile at your success but walk right past your name. By the time I landed my first big government contract, I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I'd learned the cost of sharing wins with people who only clap for someone else. I celebrated alone, with takeout and a playlist that made me feel powerful. It was the first time I realized maybe their silence wasn't about me at all. Maybe they couldn't see me because they didn't want to admit what that would mean, that they were wrong, that they'd misjudged, that someone outside their mold could actually win. And I started asking myself, how long was I going to wait for people to give me something I had already earned? That quiet moment became the seed of something bigger, a shift, a question I couldn't unask. What if I stopped hoping for a seat at their table and started designing my own? It was terrifying, but it was also the most honest thing I'd ever considered. And from that point forward, I stopped shrinking. I stopped translating my success into simpler terms so others could digest it more easily. I stopped saying, "It's nothing," when it was everything. That clarity didn't come from a book. It came from years of disappointment turned into self-respect. But clarity, as powerful as it is, doesn't always stop the past from following you. Which brings us to what happened next. Because when I walked into that gala, I didn't just carry my accomplishments. I carried every moment I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong. And this time I was done being polite about it. Starting Linksware wasn't a bold leap. It was a slow burn. One born from exhaustion and clarity. I didn't wake up and quit everything on a whim. I planned. I saved. I spent 2 years freelancing by night while working a thankless IT job by day. My body ached. My social life vanished. But something in me knew. This was the only way I'd ever own anything. My first office was my 1-bedroom apartment. I gave up my bed so I could install a second monitor on my desk. Ate beans and rice for dinner more nights than I cared to admit. And every time I thought about quitting, I remembered what it felt like to have my voice ignored around the family table. That memory became fuel. I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing freedom. The freedom to build something no one could take away from me. The freedom to prove, to myself more than anyone, that I was more than their silence, more than their avoidance. I wanted to create something undeniable, something with weight, with voice. In the early days, there were no investors, no press, no cushion, just me, a few clients, and a stubborn belief that if I kept showing up, something would break through. And eventually, it did. Slowly. A referral here, a contract there. Then came a pilot project with a local hospital, and our encryption protocols stopped a breach before it even started. That case study went viral on LinkedIn. Suddenly, People were calling me, wanting demos, asking about our systems. I didn't feel ready, but I kept saying yes, because I knew, if I waited until I felt prepared, I'd be waiting forever. And deep down, I'd already waited long enough. Growth came fast, but so did isolation. I was winning on paper. Revenue up, press mentions climbing, investors interested, but my phone didn't ring with family congratulations. No calls from cousins. No "we're proud of you" from anyone. Just silence. Again. This time, louder than ever. I remember getting featured in a national magazine. My photo, on the actual cover. I didn't even tell them. What was the point? They hadn't clapped when I won awards in college. Why would they now? I told myself I didn't need their applause. But the truth, I just didn't want to give them another chance to withhold it. Loneliness became part of the job. I could close million-dollar contracts and still eat dinner alone, watching my inbox refill overnight. I loved what I was building, but it came at a cost. A deep, invisible one. No one warns you that success can make you feel even more disconnected from the people you started out trying to impress. Worse still, Derek was thriving too, in his own way. He started a podcast, got picked up by a fitness brand, and of course, every family member reposted it, tagged him, threw emojis and hearts. My company hired 12 new employees in 1 quarter, and I couldn't even get a text back from my aunt. It was like I existed in an alternate dimension, one where I was building something powerful and real, but only outsiders seemed to care. And no matter how many contracts I landed, part of me still felt like that kid on the porch, watching the football game from behind the screen door. Then came the partnership with Northbridge Data Solutions, a $22 million security integration deal that would place Linksware at the top of the B2B cybersecurity market. It was the kind of deal that makes people pay attention. That proves you're not just surviving, you're scaling. And for a moment, I thought, maybe now they'll notice. I was invited to speak at a summit in San Francisco. My face was on the banner. It was streamed to over 80,000 people. I sent the link to my mom. She never replied. My uncle liked the post, probably by accident. That night, I sat in my hotel room staring at the city skyline, trying not to let the emptiness feel too familiar. I wanted to be proud. I was proud. But success without recognition from the people you love can feel like throwing confetti into the wind. Beautiful, sure, but it never lands. And for someone who had spent her entire life trying to be seen, that sting never dulled. Not really. Around that time, Derek announced his engagement. The family group chat exploded. Photos, emojis, champagne bottles, and firework gifts. I texted congratulations. Got no response. 2 days later, my mom sent a link to his wedding registry with a note that said, "You should come. Everyone will be there." I stared at the message for a long time. I hadn't been invited directly, but something told me this wasn't just another event. It was a test, a moment, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to shift the story. I replied simply, "I'll be there." I took that wedding invite like a dare. Not a warm invitation, but a challenge. Still, I approached it with hope, carefully chosen hope. Maybe this was it, the moment my family would finally see me, not just for what I'd built, but for who I'd become. I even let myself believe that Derek had matured too, that maybe he wanted to bridge the gap. I picked a deep emerald dress, not flashy, but powerful. I wanted to show up as the version of me I'd built with my own hands, the woman who'd raised capital, led teams, and protected networks across the country. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because I deserved to be. I brought someone with me, Jordan Banks, a data scientist and close friend who'd become something more over the past few months. He'd seen all the cracks behind the strong front and still showed up with kindness and clarity. "You sure you want me there?" he asked gently. "Yes," I told him, "because I don't want to feel alone at my own family's celebration." The wedding was set at a vineyard just outside Portland. Elegant, sprawling, curated to perfection. And walking through those arched gates, I felt it, that shift in the air, the same one I'd felt at the summit, at the awards, at family dinners, like I'd stepped onto a stage I wasn't invited to perform on. Still, I smiled, greeted people, took in the beauty of it all. I had built enough confidence not to shrink, but beneath that calm surface, my heart was pacing, because when you've spent your whole life being underestimated, even peace feels like borrowed time. We arrived early enough to mingle before the ceremony. The champagne was flowing and laughter filled the air. Everyone seemed effortlessly at home, except me. Conversations floated past, and while people nodded politely, no one asked what I did or how things were going. It was like my presence was tolerated, not celebrated. Then came the seating chart. We walked up, Jordan and I, expecting to find our names near the immediate family section. Derek's startup buddies had full tables. Distant cousins had name cards by the head table. But ours? Not on the list. Check the overflow list, the planner said, already flustered. My stomach dropped. She flipped through an iPad, paused, bit her lip. Whitmore? Yes, here we go. Table 22. I looked around. Table 22 wasn't in the main area. It was near the side, just past the catering setup. Half shaded, half forgotten. You've got to be kidding, Jordan muttered, his hand lightly brushing mine. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a last-minute change. But when I looked across the lawn and saw Derek raising a glass with our cousins, my mom standing right beside him, laughing, I knew. This wasn't an oversight. This was a message. A message I'd heard before, only this time they dressed it in linen and wine. And yet, I didn't storm off. I didn't cry. I just stood there, looking at the scene like it was an old movie I'd seen too many times. And in that moment, a switch flipped. I realized I wasn't sad. I was done. I didn't say much as we sat. Jordan, trying to lighten the mood, joked that at least we were closest to the dessert station. I gave him a tired smile, but I wasn't really present anymore. My body was at the wedding. My mind was untangling years of invisible threads that led to this very chair. Because that wasn't just a table. That was a lifetime. A lifetime of almost proud, of being mentioned after the main conversation moved on. A lifetime of showing up, hoping someone would see me, and realizing they had no intention of looking. And suddenly, I couldn't carry that anymore. It didn't erupt. No anger, no tears, just stillness. I took a sip of champagne, looked around, and made a decision. Not to fight, not to argue, just to walk away. Not from the wedding, but from the need to be approved, to be let in, because the door had never really been open, and I had finally stopped knocking. Jordan watched me carefully. What are you thinking? He asked, his voice low. I smiled. That maybe the most powerful thing I can do right now is take up space anyway, and then decide who I let sit at my table. And right there, under fairy lights and false smiles, I stopped being the one waiting to be seen, and became the one deciding where I belong. And that decision? It was the beginning of everything. The ceremony itself was beautiful, at least on the surface. Vows read like carefully scripted lines, the kind you rehearse more than you feel. The sun hit just right through the vineyard trees. Everyone applauded, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept circling back to table 22. I hadn't been placed there by accident. I'd been placed there on purpose. The message was clear. We'll tolerate you, but only from a distance. As Derek kissed his bride and the crowd cheered, I felt more like staff than family, like a footnote at my own brother's milestone. And it wasn't the first time I'd felt this invisible, but it might be the last time I let it slide. As the guests made their way to the reception area, the tension in my chest grew heavier. Everyone was laughing, toasting, posing for group photos. I watched from the side, feeling like I was holding a backstage pass to a show I helped produce, but was never invited to perform in. Jordan leaned in, whispering, "Are you okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't. But I wasn't unraveling either. I was observing, not sad, awake. And awareness, I've learned, always comes before the shift. The reception tent was grand, filled with crystal chandeliers and pastel florals. It looked like a dream, but it was built on layers of exclusion, and I was done pretending that wasn't the case. When we reached our assigned seats, it hit harder than I expected. No place cards with our names, no acknowledgement from family nearby, just a folded corner of a paper tent marker with guests written in light cursive. I stared at it for a long time. That one word, impersonal and careless, said everything they thought of me. To the side of us, I could see Derek's college friends joking and laughing, seated just rows from the stage. Far ahead, my mom was smiling at a distant relative I hadn't seen in years. I wasn't just excluded, I'd been erased, polished out of the picture like an old smudge they didn't want to admit was ever part of the frame. As plates were served, a waiter leaned over and quietly asked if I had any dietary restrictions. I thanked him for the kindness. He was the only person who'd spoken directly to me since we arrived. Jordan reached under the table and gently squeezed my hand. I hadn't said a word in 15 minutes, but he knew what was happening. Then came the speeches. Derek's best man told a story from high school involving a prank and a trophy. The crowd roared. My name wasn't mentioned once. Neither was my company. Neither was any part of me. And still, I sat. Still, I listened. But I was no longer hoping to be recognized, because somewhere between the salad and the first toast I understood. I didn't need a microphone. I already had a platform, and they could try to keep me out of the picture. But I'd learned how to create my own spotlight. Then, it happened. The moment that snapped the last thread. The DJ called tables up to the buffet in groups. Tables 1 through 10, he announced. I looked around. We were table 22. 22. I waited. No one came back for us. No one checked in. No one even looked our way. We were invisible in plain sight. After nearly 40 minutes, Jordan stood. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "We're getting food. Now." I followed, silent but resolute. We weren't trying to make a scene. We were trying to be treated like human beings. As we approached the buffet, a woman with a headset gently blocked us. "I'm sorry. We're asking guests to wait for their group." Jordan looked at her. "We've been skipped." She hesitated, looked at her list, then shrugged. "I don't see table 22 on here, but I guess you can go now." That shrug, that careless gesture, it felt like a slap. It told me everything I needed to know about my place in that moment. Back at the table, I stared at the food I no longer had the appetite to eat. Around us, laughter echoed like a distant broadcast from a world I'd never been allowed to live in. And in the middle of that noise, I realized there was no misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and worse, it was familiar. I turned to Jordan. "Let's step outside," I said. My voice was calm. Too calm, because when you've been pushed aside your whole life, the moment you finally stand up doesn't feel loud. It feels still, like a line being drawn. You know you'll never uncross. Outside the tent, the evening air felt sharper, almost electric. Jordan stood beside me, quiet, giving me space without disappearing. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I felt something deeper. Clarity, a clean, almost frightening kind, like I was watching the pieces of an old story collapse in slow motion. "You don't have to go back in," he said, gently. I nodded, but I also knew. I did. Not for them, for me, because there was something about this night that felt final, like the closing scene of a chapter I didn't realize I'd been dragging for too long. I pulled my phone from my clutch, opened my email, drafted a message to my board and my leadership team. Subject line: internal only, potential contract withdrawal discussion. Just drafting it made my breath steady. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment. Because one of Derek's groomsmen was a VP at a firm I had signed a $9 million cybersecurity contract with the month before. That partnership had been rocky from the start. And now, seeing the way they casually allowed disrespect to flow into everything they touched, I finally saw the pattern. I hit save, not send. Not yet. But for the first time, I saw my silence as an act of compliance. And I wasn't going to be compliant anymore. Not in business, not in family, not in life. We stepped back into the tent just as the DJ called for the bride and groom's dance. Everyone clapped. Flashbulbs popped. I didn't rush to find my seat. Instead, I walked slowly toward the front, toward the people who had spent their entire lives talking around me. Derek was laughing with a group near the dance floor. My mother stood just behind him, dabbing her eyes dramatically as the couple danced. She looked up, saw me, and smiled, almost relieved, like seeing me there, smiling politely, meant things were fine. They weren't. I walked past her, past the guests, right to the head table, and without raising my voice, without drama, I said, "Excuse me, Derek? Do you have a moment?" He turned, surprised, mid-laugh. "Claire, hey, isn't this beautiful?" he said, gesturing toward the crowd. I nodded. "It is, and I just wanted to say congratulations." He looked relieved. "Thanks, sis. Really means a lot." I smiled, steady. "One more thing," I added. "Table 22? That won't happen again." I didn't wait for a response. I turned, walked straight to the coordinator's desk, and asked to speak to the venue manager. Jordan followed me, silent and steady. I didn't need backup, but his presence was a reminder. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Outside the venue manager's office, I called my legal counsel. I gave instructions to begin reviewing the exit clause for the client contract connected to the groom's circle. "Is this about the wedding?" she asked, concerned. "No," I said. "This is about values." I stepped away from the reception, stood in the gravel lot, and looked up at the stars. They were faint, nearly washed out by the soft glow of expensive lighting and curated perfection, but they were still there, unbothered, unbending. I breathed in, deep and slow, and let go of the need to explain, to prove, to wait. I had carried that need like an extra limb for years, but not anymore. That night didn't break me. It broke the illusion. And what remained wasn't fragile. It was focused. As Jordan joined me, handing me a jacket he'd quietly grabbed from the car, he looked at me and said, You don't have to say it, but I know. You're done. I nodded. Not out of anger. Out of truth. I can't build an empire and still beg for a seat at their table. He smiled. Then maybe it's time you built a new one. And right then, under that expensive white tent of curated belonging, I decided my table would be bigger, brighter, and it would never seat people who needed me small to feel important. The next day, the emails started. First, from the client VP I'd seen at the wedding. Hope you enjoyed the event. Great seeing you there. Let's catch up soon? I didn't respond. He knew what happened. They all did. Polite small talk was just a shield they used to protect themselves from accountability. Then came the internal chatter. My COO flagged concerns about that same client's behavior. Delays, vague deliverables, power games. The wedding wasn't a one-off. It was a reflection of how they operated in every area. And now that I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I scheduled a full review of the contract, privately notifying our key staff. If they don't align with our values, we step away, I told them, even if it stings financially. There was a pause on the call, then nods, full support. That's the thing about building something real. You don't need to yell to lead. You act. At that moment, I realized something powerful. They had no real hold over me. Not the client, not the family, not the people who underestimated me for decades. Their validation had been a leash I'd outgrown, and the moment I let go of needing it, everything shifted. For the first time in my career, I felt entirely in control, not because I was winning, but because I finally understood why I was playing. I wasn't here to impress anyone. I was here to build something that respected me back. That week, something strange started to happen. Quiet messages rolled in, from people who had seen how I carried myself at the wedding. A former investor messaged, "The way you held your head high? That's leadership." A woman I barely knew from Derek's circle DM'd me, "Thank you for not pretending everything was fine. You have no idea what that meant." Even the venue manager reached out. "We've never had a guest handle something so unfair with so much poise," she said. "If you ever need a space for a company event, it's on us." That wasn't pity. That was respect. That was earned not by shouting, but by refusing to shrink. It dawned on me. People notice who you are in moments of discomfort. They see what you tolerate, what you walk away from, what you no longer allow. And without realizing it, I had set a boundary so loud it echoed far beyond that vineyard. A podcast host who had interviewed me a year prior called to reschedule a new feature, this time not just about cybersecurity, but about leadership as a woman who doesn't flinch. "You made a lot of people uncomfortable," she said. "That's usually a sign you're doing something right." I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, but the ripple effect proved something to me. Integrity leaves a bigger legacy than perfection ever will. That weekend, Jordan and I took a short trip to the coast. No laptops, no headlines, just ocean, air, and silence, the healing kind. I watched the waves and thought about all the versions of me that had tried so hard to earn love that wasn't available. It wasn't tragic. It was just over. "I don't think I was ever really rejected," I told Jordan. "I think I was miscategorized." He looked up from his book, curious. They didn't know what to do with someone like me. I didn't fit the story, so they wrote me out, and I kept trying to write myself back in, instead of starting a new one. It was the kind of clarity that doesn't come from a breakthrough, but from enough. Enough trying, enough hoping, enough contorting. There's a peace that shows up when you finally stop asking for a place and start creating space. I realized I was never meant to belong in their world, not because I wasn't worthy, but because their world was too small for what I was becoming. And that's not ego. That's honesty. Some rooms are too quiet for people with full voices. As we walked the shoreline, hand in hand, I thought about every version of me that tried to stay polite, make peace, take the high road. She brought me far. But now I was ready to lead from the front, not beg from the back. A few days later, I was invited to a roundtable panel with executives in the cybersecurity space. Normally, I'd keep things technical, talk about encryption, risk management, infrastructure. But this time, I spoke from a different place. I told the story, not of the wedding, but of what it taught me. I talked about boundaries, about how sometimes the most professional thing you can do is walk away from a deal that doesn't respect your values, even when there's money on the line. The room went quiet, not uncomfortable, attentive. You could feel the air shift. Afterward, 3 founders came up to me. "I've been struggling with that," one said. "Thanks for saying it out loud." Another told me she had stayed in a toxic partnership for 2 years, out of fear of looking difficult. My words didn't just land, they unlocked something. That was when I truly understood the ripple. It wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about giving permission to others to do the same. Because when someone finally says, enough, it creates space for others to say it too. And for the first time in my career, I didn't feel like I was fighting to be heard. I felt like I was the voice in the room. Back at Linksware, the internal review was complete. The client tied to Derek's circle had multiple red flags. Inconsistent comms, poor onboarding, scope creep disguised as collaboration. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone, scheduled a termination meeting, and ended the contract. It wasn't dramatic, no threats, no raised voices, just clear language. This partnership no longer reflects the standards or culture we're committed to at Linksware. Silence followed on the other end. Then, a forced, "We'll be in touch." I already knew they wouldn't. It cost us short-term revenue, but it cleared a path for something bigger. Within 72 hours, we had a new inbound lead from a company I'd admired for years. Clean track record, human-centered leadership, better margins, a better fit in every way. Funny how quickly space gets filled when you're willing to make room for what's right. I'd been afraid for so long that walking away would make me look unstable, but instead, it made us stronger, clearer, sharper, and maybe that's what boundaries really do. They don't close doors, they open better ones. And that weekend, we had a small dinner with a few friends and team members. No speeches, no toasts, just good food and real laughter. And somewhere between the second course and dessert, I realized this is what it feels like to belong, without effort, without performance. The conversations were curious. No one tiptoed around my accomplishments or tried to measure them. They asked because they cared. They listened because they respected me. No hierarchy, no spotlight, just genuine connection. Jordan leaned over and whispered, "This is your table now." I smiled, because he was right. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I was building spaces where people could show up whole, myself included, and that became the blueprint, not just for my personal life, but for how I ran Linksware. Every hire, every client, every partnership had to align. No more contracts signed under pressure. No more staying silent to keep the peace. I wasn't chasing success anymore. I was building something far more sustainable, a life and a company where I never had to shrink to fit. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to reach my family. Word got around. I had walked away from a major contract tied to Derek's new network. And suddenly, I wasn't just the quiet cousin in tech. I was a problem, a disruptor, the kind of woman who makes choices that can't be ignored. My mother called 2 days later. "Claire, I heard something, and I just wanted to make sure it's not true." Her voice was soft, cautious, like she didn't know who she was talking to anymore. I confirmed it, calmly. "It is true, and it wasn't a whim. It was a professional decision, a boundary." She didn't yell. She sighed. "I just wish you hadn't made things so complicated for the family." That sentence landed heavier than she probably intended, because to her, peace meant letting things slide. To me, it had always meant hiding parts of myself to keep others comfortable. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my office, replaying the conversation in my head. No apology, no curiosity, just concern about how my actions reflected on them. And yet, I wasn't angry. I was sad, not because they didn't get it, but because I finally understood they probably never would. And that, strangely enough, was freeing. There's relief in realizing you're no longer trying to be understood by people committed to misinterpreting you. I didn't need to be accepted to know my value. I had already accepted myself. Then came the message I never expected. From my Aunt Lorraine, quiet, reserved, and usually too careful to speak up. "I saw what happened," it read, "and I just want you to know, I've been watching you for years. I've always admired how you carry yourself." She told me stories I'd never heard. How she'd been pushed aside in her 20s when she wanted to open a design firm. How she gave up after being called too ambitious at family dinners. "You're doing what I didn't have the courage to do," she wrote. "You're showing the next generation that they're allowed to take up space." That message cracked something open in me. It reminded me that visibility isn't just about being seen. It's about making it safer for others to show up fully. 2. My decisions weren't happening in a vacuum. They were signals. And someone, many someones, were receiving them. I started hearing from colleagues, acquaintances, even old classmates, people saying things like, "I wish I'd known someone like you when I was younger," or "You reminded me it's okay to walk away from places that don't value me." These weren't empty compliments. They were real moments of connection. And with every message, the sadness faded a little, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Even when you lose the approval of people you once craved, you might gain something far more valuable: alignment. One morning, I opened an old photo album. Not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. I wanted to see the faces I'd spent so long chasing. And when I looked at them now, I saw something different. Not power, not judgment, just people. People doing the best they could, with very limited emotional range. There I was at 7, grinning in a homemade costume for a school science fair. No one had come to see me that day, but the joy on my face? Joy, untouched. At 12, sitting in front of a computer bigger than the desk itself, eyes wide with focus. Alone? Yes, but not defeated. I used to look at those photos and feel grief, like I had failed her, little Claire, for not getting the recognition she deserved. But now I saw it differently. I hadn't failed her. I had protected her. I had built a life where she could finally breathe. That girl in the photos didn't need rescuing. She just needed time. Time to become someone who could carry both the weight of being underestimated and the freedom of finally letting that weight go. And as I closed the album, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else, "You did good. You made it." And it was never about them. There's a difference between closure and revenge, and I was learning that in real time. I didn't want to win against my family anymore. I wanted to release the grip they had on the parts of me still looking for applause. It wasn't hate. It wasn't anger. It was surrender, the healthy kind. I stopped attending family functions, not in protest, in peace. When my mother texted about a cousin's baby shower, I replied with kindness but didn't go. "Hope it's a beautiful day," I said. No guilt, no edge, just boundaries, clear, clean, calm. I started hosting my own traditions, friendsgivings with people who asked real questions and listened, Sunday dinners with teammates who had become chosen family, the kind of gatherings where laughter didn't come at someone's expense, and no one had to shrink to fit in. There's grief in letting go of what should have been, but there's also relief in no longer forcing it to be something it never was. My family wasn't a safe space. That didn't make them evil. It just made them not mine. And sometimes, that's all the clarity you need. The need to be loved by everyone had quietly died, and in its place, something stronger was blooming. The desire to live fully, even if that meant being misunderstood. With the emotional weight lifted, my leadership shifted too. I became bolder in how I spoke at conferences, more transparent in how I led my team. I wasn't afraid to say things like, "That's not aligned with our culture," or, "I need time to think about this." That confidence wasn't performative. It was practiced. We revamped our onboarding process at Linksware to include core emotional values, not just metrics. Words like respect, clarity, autonomy became pillars of how we worked. I even launched an internal mentorship initiative for women in tech who had felt overlooked or undervalued. It filled up in 48 hours. I wasn't just leading a company anymore. I was shaping an ecosystem, one where brilliance wasn't judged by volume, and power didn't require stepping on anyone else. That vision had come from pain, but it was built with purpose. In interviews, people often asked what kept me motivated. Honestly, I'd say, I stopped waiting to be invited and built my own stage. Turns out a lot of people were waiting for someone to do the same. And each time I shared that truth, someone else stood up a little taller. Because real confidence doesn't scream. It grounds. And now I was rooted. Some nights, I still think about that wedding. Not with resentment, just perspective. I remember the music, the lights, the echo of a name I used to chase like a finish line. And I'm grateful, not because they hurt me, but because they showed me who I didn't want to be. Pain has a funny way of shaping clarity. It takes what's blurred and outlines it with precision. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of exclusion on anyone, I also wouldn't erase it. Because every moment I was ignored taught me how to pay attention. To myself and to others. I learned to show up for people who feel invisible. To make room for voices that carry quiet brilliance. I don't just lead with strategy now. I lead with empathy. Because I know what it's like to sit in the corner of a room you helped build and still feel like you don't belong. But now, I do belong. Not because anyone gave me permission, but because I finally stopped asking. I claimed my space. I built it brick by brick, value by value, moment by moment. And in that space, there is room for me, for those like me, for anyone ready to stop shrinking. Because this story, it doesn't end with a fight. It ends with freedom. It didn't happen overnight, but piece by piece, a new kind of family started to take shape. Not tied by blood, but by choice. People who showed up, who stayed, who asked how I was really doing and actually listened. We built rituals out of nothing. Dinners, hikes, slow Sunday mornings with pancakes and unfiltered laughter. Jordan, steady as ever, became a fixture, not just in my life, but in my world. He knew how to hold space without fixing, how to challenge without criticizing. And for the first time, I wasn't performing to earn love. I was simply being, and that was enough. My team felt it too. We weren't just scaling a business. We were building culture, a place where no one had to apologize for taking up space, where wins were celebrated and emotions were honored. The energy shifted, and with it, so did the outcomes. More trust, more clarity, more momentum. That year, I hosted our first Links Week, a retreat for team members, partners, and allies who had helped shape the company's values. It wasn't flashy. No ego, just connection. We laughed until we cried. We shared stories that had never seen daylight before. And for the first time, I saw what I'd created through other people's eyes. It wasn't just a company, it was a mirror. One I had been unknowingly shaping out of every moment I had felt invisible, and every decision I made to never let someone else feel that way again. 6 months later, we were featured on the cover of Fast Company, not just for our tech, but for how we were redefining leadership in cybersecurity. The article didn't just praise our innovation. It spotlighted our humanity, the way we made people feel safe not just online, but inside the company too. This time, I didn't cry in a hotel room alone. I didn't look for validation. I looked around. Jordan was pouring coffee in the kitchen, humming. My phone was buzzing with messages from mentees, teammates, even industry peers who'd watched the journey unfold. I walked into the office that morning with a quiet smile. No speech, just presence. And as the team applauded and gathered for a group photo, I thought, this feels like enough. Not in a small way, but in a full, deep, peaceful way, like a note that finally resolved after years of dissonance. At the after-party, someone asked what the biggest lesson had been. I answered without hesitation. The real win was learning to stop shrinking to stay palatable. It landed like a stone in still water. A few people clapped. A few just nodded slowly, eyes wide. Because when success comes from truth, not compromise, it doesn't just shine brighter, it lasts longer. Later that year, I was invited to give a keynote at the very university I once graduated from, with no family in attendance. Standing on that stage, looking out at rows of bright, anxious, hopeful faces, I saw little versions of me in every seat, hungry, unseen, ready. I didn't talk about my company first. I talked about Table 22, about what it means to be invited, but not welcomed, about how you don't have to wait for permission to own your space. The auditorium was silent, not heavy, electric. Every word landed like oxygen on a smoldering spark. When I stepped off the stage, students lined up to speak. One said, I was going to leave tech. I didn't think I could survive it, but now I'm going to build something too. That moment, that was it. The full circle. Not applause, not awards, just impact. Later that night, I pulled out a photo I had framed in my office, that same one from the science fair. 7-year-old Claire, grinning despite everything. I whispered to her, you didn't just make it. You made space for others too. And in that stillness, I felt it. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. And finally, belonging. It wasn't flashy or staged, but on a quiet morning, over coffee and sunlight pouring into the kitchen, Jordan looked at me and said, so, want to build something forever together? I didn't need a ring to know the answer. I already had everything I never thought I'd find. Peace, partnership, presence. We didn't rush. There was no grand proposal video, no viral engagement post. Just two people who'd walked through fire and came out softer, not bitter. We made a plan that felt like us. Intimate, intentional, sacred. A small cabin wedding in the redwoods. Just a few witnesses. Just truth. I wore a simple dress. No veil. No aisle. No performance. Just my full self, walking freely, no father to give me away, because I was never anyone's to surrender. Jordan looked at me like he'd seen every past version of me, and loved each one without trying to fix her. As we said our vows, I realized something no stage or award had ever given me. I was safe, and safety, when you've never truly known it, feels like the most radical kind of love. Our marriage wasn't the happy ending. It was a continuation, a decision to build something not because we needed to fill a void, but because we had space to expand. Today, Linksware isn't just thriving, it's evolving. We've launched mentorship programs, DEI initiatives, and mental health stipends for all employees. Not as perks, but as foundations. Because success without humanity isn't success, it's performance. And I'm done performing. I now mentor young women in tech, especially those who feel invisible. I tell them, "You're not too much. They're just too small." And every time one of them speaks up in a meeting, launches a project, or says no to something that doesn't align, I feel like we're pushing the walls wider for everyone. We also started a fund to invest in founders who've been overlooked, especially women of color, queer leaders, first-gen trailblazers, not out of charity, but justice. Their ideas aren't risky. They're revolutionary. They just need a stage. Or better yet, a seat at their own table. Looking back, I realize all the silence, the erasure, the exile. It wasn't punishment. It was redirection. I wasn't meant to break into their circle. I was meant to build one of my own, one big enough to hold everyone who'd been kept small for too long. And that's what I'm building now. Not just tech, not just success, but legacy. One that doesn't just survive, but multiplies. Sometimes people ask if I've spoken to Derek again. The answer is yes, briefly. At a cousin's memorial. We were civil, polite, but I didn't feel the need to explain anything. Not my choices, not my growth, not my distance. Some gaps aren't meant to be closed. They're meant to stay open, as reminders. My mother and I talk now and then. She asks about Jordan, about work. The conversations are lighter, safer, because I stopped trying to dig depth where none existed. I love her. I just don't need her to understand me anymore to feel whole. And that's the final freedom, isn't it? To let go of needing a certain version of the past to feel worthy in the present. I didn't rewrite my story to get a happier ending. I reclaimed it so I could start living beyond it. As I sit here writing this, the sun's rising over another Monday morning. The inbox is full. The coffee's hot. The world's spinning fast. And yet, I'm steady, rooted, clear, no longer seeking belonging, just being. Because this story wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving me right. You know, if you made it all the way here, there's a good chance this story hit something deep. Maybe you've been that person. The one left at table 22. The one who worked twice as hard to be half as seen. And if that's you, I just want to say, you're not alone. Stories like this don't just happen to characters. They happen to people. To women building in silence. To men carrying wounds they were never allowed to name. To anyone who's ever walked into a room hoping to be chosen, and walked out wondering if they ever belonged there in the first place. And if this story moved you in any way, I'd love to ask you for something simple but powerful. Subscribe to the channel, not for metrics, but because when you show up here, you tell the algorithm that these stories matter, that emotional honesty, resilience, and growth deserve more space on your screen. Also, if you feel called to help this channel keep telling stories that actually matter, you can scroll just below the video and click on Super Thanks. It's a small way to support a huge mission, making sure voices like Claire's, like yours, keep reaching the people who need them most. And before you go, I'd love to know, have you ever had your own Table 22 moment? Drop it in the comments. Or just say, I see me in this. Because every story becomes bigger when it's shared, and yours deserves to be heard too.